Hi, this is Lou, welcome to my channel, and today I'm going to be sharing how I painted this mid-century inspired geometric abstract watercolour painting. So I want to create different areas in this painting. Some of them I want to be really loose and fluid, and then other ones really detailed. So I'm starting with those areas that I want to be loose and flowy and floaty. I've just used some masking tape to tape off those areas, and I'm using a spray bottle to get my paper wet and to move my paint around. Just adding some dabs of Payne's Grey and then more water sprayed on, allowing the paint to flow and move wherever it wants to. So I start by doing one half in that way and then moving on and just doing a little slice on the other half of the page, this time taping off the centre and just placing some paper over the area I've already painted, so I don't get more water on it. Again, I allow this side to dry and the paint to flow wherever it fancies. For the centre section, I know that I want something much more controlled. So I'm using a ruler to mark out the areas that I want to paint. I want to create little blocks, each with different sorts of geometric shapes in it. Some quite big and some quite small. I mark out a square and find the centre so that I can use that to put a circle in. And then I've got some rectangular blocks of different sizes. I try and keep my pencil lines quite light so that you won't see them underneath the paint. I use my compasses to make the big circles so that I get them nice and accurate. But you could do them freehand if you want to, or you could find something to draw around. Depends what kind of look you're going for. But I want really accurate circles, so I'm using compasses to draw them. I'm going to do some smaller circles as well, and these I'll just freehand because they don't need to be quite so accurate. And while the painting for the outside panels was done in almost seconds, I'm going to take my time with the centre stripe. I've got my palette of carefully selected kind of neutralish paints, and I'm going to use pretty much all of them, I think, in some way. I've got quite a few blues and greys in this palette, and I know I'm going to use those for some of the areas, but I want a contrast as well. So I'm starting out just mixing a kind of putty colour. I'm using some buff titanium, some Davies grey, and then in some areas I'll add in little bits of a kind of burnt orange colour. This is quinacridone burnt orange. I got this because I really like quinacridone gold, but in some of my samples it could kind of turn a little bit greeny, so I wanted something that was more on the red side, so I've gone with this burnt orange. It's a really quite powerful colour, so I'm just adding a tiny bit to start with. And I can always go over it and make it deeper if I want to later on. And then I start putting in some of my bluey grey slaty colours. For most of these areas I'm using a mix of different colours. For this one I'm using Lunar Blue and some Hematite Genuine. The Hematite Genuine I'm mixing in with lots of colours because it creates this lovely speckledy effect that looks like stone. It does that when you use it on its own, and it can be like a lovely warm grey black, but you can also mix it with these other colours and get some really interesting effects. I'm also using Moonglow by Daniel Smith. Again, randomly mixed in the mixing well that I mixed the other colours in, so there'll be bits of everything in there. But the Moonglow dries in a really interesting way, and you kind of get some bluey areas and some pinky areas. When it comes to painting my circles, I like to fill in the centre and leave the edges, and then very carefully take a brush and go around the edge just taking the colour up to my pencil line with the very tip of the brush. I take my time trying to get the edge nice and smooth. And then when I've got the shape right, I can then play with the colour. I can dab in areas for darker colour. Again, I'm using a mix of Payne's Grey, Lunar Blue, Moonglow and Hematite Genuine. For these smaller circles, I'm making them quite dark and really just using the same Payne's Grey as I used in the outer panels. Making sure I've got enough of that Payne's Grey in the centre panel will link all of the painting together. I've got a couple of these rectangles left over now, and I want to start dividing those up into even smaller areas. These I do freehand, but you could sketch them out if you wanted to. But I just start adding in some stripes, echoes of the shapes that I've already got in there. I'm dotting around the page so that I allow areas to dry before I paint the areas next to them. And I can also paint over areas and add more detail. So on this grey rectangle, I'm painting more grey rectangles. This time much smaller. I'm making them all the same height, but making the gaps between them different sizes and making the widths of the little rectangles different sizes too. Put in a row of little circles at the top. And again, I haven't sketched these out. I'm just putting in the basic shapes, making them smaller than I know I want them to be eventually, and using a small brush, going very carefully around the outside to try and make them as round and as neat as I can. Again, I use quite a small brush with a very, very fine point to paint in between the circles. That allows me to get into those tiny little corners and fill in those areas with colour. Now I'm nearly getting there. I've got a few gaps at the bottom and I'll just slowly fill those in, wait for them to dry and then come and add the next bit. While I'm waiting for those to dry, I can survey the rest of the piece and see if it needs anything else. And I decide it needs much more of this burnt orange colour. So I go over some areas and add more of that colour in. I know I want to add more mark making into this, and I'm getting to the limit of what I can do with a paintbrush. So I take a pen, and this one's a fine liner, and quite often I use a black fine liner, but I found these ones recently that are grey, and I thought that would work really well with this. You'll be able to see the marks, but they won't stand out, they won't jump out of the page at you. And the designs I make are really simple. Just lines. Lines around the edges of the circle, like a kind of clock face. Lines to demark some of those stripes that I put in, and then lots and lots of lines on this big circle, covering the whole thing. So I do the right hand side of the circle first, and then when I've finished I can turn the page around and do the left hand side. This also helps me not to put my hand down in areas of the paint that are still wet, because some of those stripes at the bottom are still a little bit damp, but I am being very careful not to fill in any areas with a pen until they're completely dry. I want some areas of highlight, so I can go back over with a white pen this time, and I'm using a white Posca acrylic marker. Just adding some dots, some of those same lines in white to brighten up some of the lighter areas and create more of a contrast with the dark, and to add more detail into these tiny little striped areas. Now the painting part of this is finished, but there's something else I want to add, and that is some metal leaf. I do use metal leaf quite a bit in my printmaking, and occasionally I've used it on watercolours as well, but I've never shown it in a video. And I do plan to do a more comprehensive video showing you how to do gold leafing, or in this case copper leafing. But basically I'm painting on a size which is a kind of glue that it dries down, but it always stays a little bit tacky. That's what the metal leaf will adhere to. So I'm just painting this on in a couple of thin stripes. I don't have to wait long for it to dry, and then I can remove the tape. Then I can apply my metal leaf. In this case I'm using copper, and it comes on these sheets with this orange tracing paper backing, which makes it easy to apply. There's always a little bit of excess, and I just use a soft brush to brush away what I can. In this case, there were a few tiny little bits that I couldn't get rid of with the brush, so I just use the scalpel to very, very carefully remove those extra bits and tidy up the whole thing. So my painting is now done, but you might notice it's a little bit messy around the edges. That's okay, because I have plans for this. I am planning to mount this onto a cradled wooden panel, and those excess bits around the edge, where it's all a little bit messy, they're all going to be trimmed away. Now I'm still working through my process for mounting, but when I've done a few more and I've got it down to a fine art, then I will make a video about how I've done this. As a final touch, I've got these wooden tray frames to try. So I'll just pop this in here and see how it looks. So thanks very much for watching today. If you give this a go or something like it, then I'd really love to see. You can post your work to Instagram, tag me at Lou Rachel Davis, and I love seeing what you make. And I love hearing about how it's inspired you to get painting, to keep painting, and to keep creating. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.